now back to Hello Houston. To comment on any of today's topics, call or text 713-440-8870 or email us at talk@hellohouston.org. Now here's Celeste, Diaz, Schurman, and Frank Billingsley.
Women Who Talk to the Dead, Katherine Schweit's newest book, tells the remarkable true story of the largest exhumation effort in FBI history. It follows Detroit detective Shannon Jones and FBI special agent Leslie Larson, whose dogged pursuit of justice reopened more than 70 years of unsolved murders, bringing home to over 200 cold case victims once buried and forgotten. To tell us more about the book and her career, we welcome Katherine Schweit herself. She is an attorney, author, and former senior FBI official. Katherine, welcome to Hello Houston, and that's a pretty cool title, Senior FBI Official.
That's some credentials. You got the cred.
That
the
is
cred.
Well, thank you. It's a kind of a job. It's the job. You work your way into a job. You're just working, and you're doing you work hard because you believe in, the Constitution and your job and the people you have to protect, and you end up suddenly as an executive. It just kind of turned out that way, and I'm honored to have served in the FBI for 20 years.
I bet.
So, Katherine, as we look at that, you were the senior FBI official, attorney. How did that transition come to become an author?
I'm actually a journalist. In my old days, when I was a kid, I was a journalist. I always wanted to be a journalist because I watched the Watergate hearings, and I just thought that, the newspapers, the Fourth Estate would be the ones. And so I did work as a journalist for a while, but then I moved on to become a prosecutor in Chicago and the FBI. But the writing really kind of called to me. And the person that you mentioned, who's from the FBI, Leslie Larson, who's the subject, one of the subjects of this book, is a friend of mine. And one day she was telling me about this story, about this thing that they were doing that they've been working on for years. And I said, I have to write about that. I mean, we have to elevate this story, because even though it's a story about 200 cold case murders that spanned over 70 years, it's really, more importantly, a story about social justice. Yeah. It's really social justice for both the victims and the cities and the families who never even knew. These were murdered but missing people because they were buried in paupers' graves without names.
Wow.
And so, so often we hear about...
I was going to ask, these women that were murdered, it wasn't like a domestic murder and you've solved that case. These were people who just disappeared.
Right. They were people found, dismembered and burned in buildings, scooped up out of the river, frozen to death on the streets of Detroit in the middle of the winter. No name, no identification, babies, children. Oh. And they, men, women, a lot of people from marginalized communities, maybe people who didn't get the attention that they should have, whether because of the victim's socioeconomic status or their race, or because the city of Detroit is filed for bankruptcy a couple of times during that time. And the victims their cases just fell by the wayside. Mm-hmm. But the detective and the law enforcement from the FBI, the agent from the FBI, they felt this pull to justify, to protect these people. So it's really a social justice story.
So are we in the midst of trying to solve these cold cases, or have some of them been solved?
Some of them have been solved. We are in the midst. I decided to kind of cap the book at the 5 years. I've been working on this book for 6 years. Oh, wow. And I went out to the cemetery with them. I wanted the story to tell readers and listeners, it's an audiobook also, in ebook. I wanted it to tell the story of how this occurs, because so often we might hear about an exhumation to identify a person who might be a murderer or a subject, criminal. This is 200 people unearthed so we could identify victims and reconnect them with family members who disappeared, who they just disappeared, and the family members had no idea where they went. So in some cases, they have already, if you can imagine, knocked on a door and said, hey, do you know where your dad is? Oh, he left when my mom was pregnant. Well, actually, sit down. Let me tell you. just like in the movies. Let me tell you, your dad was murdered in Detroit. He was the 11th victim of a serial murder, but we didn't know who he was. So he was buried in a pauper's grave 40 years ago.
Wow. So I'm guessing, I'm a big DNA guy. I'm guessing DNA has played at least a fairly consequential role in some of this.
Yeah, DNA is really why they decided to dig these, open these cases up, make them active. And they said, let's do this marker. If we don't have DNA, then we're going to go in, pull the bones, get DNA, because DNA really wasn't available, till the 80s. And it's still expensive to exhume a body, thousands of dollars. And so Shannon came to Leslie and kind of talked her into saying, hey, look, I work missing persons, but my missing persons are crossing over these murder victim cases, I think. So let's use any place where we don't have DNA. Let's dig up the bodies. And in fact, it's really kind of the forensic advances, because now they're doing genetic genealogy to identify other people. It was genetic genealogy that allowed them to connect after they got the DNA, to connect the 11th victim of the serial killer and identify her.
And you mentioned how, Leslie Larson, it kind of started, she was telling you these incredible stories and you wanted to share this really cool part of these stories, but then also talk about the process. And as you were telling us right now about how y'all are able to go to family members of these victims and say, this is actually what happened. It sounds like these are stories of hope, but there's also a lot of stories of healing.
It is. I love that you bring that up, because more than anything, I've spent a lot of time. Detroit is my hometown, so this is very personal to me.
Sure.
And I live in the Washington, D.C. area, but I've spent a lot of time up in the Detroit area, both in the 5 years they were digging these bodies up over 5 successive summers. And then also with people who have family members who have been missing for decades. And it is their whole life in some ways. And sure. The healing that occurs. I mean, there's a person that I feature in the book whose mom disappeared when he was 14. His whole life he had in front of him, and how this effort, this tenacity from the police officers and the FBI personnel and all the other hundreds of volunteers and people who worked on this, how it changed his life forever when he was reunited with his mom.
So you talk about finding the victims. Has this led to finding some of the perpetrators of these crimes?
You can't really solve a murder, right? Unless you find the perpetrator. Right. So some cases that yes is the answer, short answer. And in some cases I think Leslie and Shannon said to me, our first goal has to be to identify the person and reconnect them with their families, because sometimes even a family member might be involved in a death. They don't want the murder solved. Maybe this was Roe v. Wade, before Roe v. Wade, maybe somebody left their child. They had a child and left the child on the street to die, and they have gone on and had their own family, and they don't want to be connected back with that. And if they can't connect them back for sure, genetically, people aren't going to cooperate. Witnesses die. That's part of being an FBI agent. The further away from the crime, the harder it is to solve. It doesn't mean that you don't have an idea of who it is. And I think they already have many cases where they have an idea who it is, and they're working with the prosecutor's office to see whether they can prosecute.
Wow.
No.
So what's the most challenging part of all of this? Getting people to talk?
I think that, they've identified about 35 people so far, which is incredible. 35 victims who have been identified now have a name and a gravestone that family can come to.
Is this 35 out of 200? The
35 out of 200 so far, because the DNA is still going to the laboratories. It's going to the FBI laboratory and other laboratories for testing to get the DNA work done. And then the genetics that have to go in the DNA genetic matching. And I think that challenge is that finding the genetic matches. So for this is something to consider. This is in Detroit. This is happening all over. This could happen all over the United States. It's kind of a simple roadmap. Leslie Larson from the FBI said to every department, call me, I'll show you how to do it. We'll come and show you how to do it. Every city has people who are missing, and you don't know where that missing person went. But when you say, what's the most challenging part? I love that question, because really, if there isn't a DNA match, someplace in a database, we can't connect them back together. So you may have had somebody who went missing in Houston. They moved, their whole family moved to Detroit. Now they know that Uncle so-and-so went missing in Houston. If the DNA is in a database somewhere, and there is a Department of Justice database that's not the criminal database, NamUs, and then that database is useful to law enforcement all over the United States, and essentially all over the world.
You know, when you were working with Detroit Police Detective Shannon Jones and FBI Special Agent Leslie Larson, y'all were figuring these things out, and you're talking and you're collaborating with a lot of people. Was there anything that really surprised you or stood out in the process as the three of y'all were working together to tell these stories?
I think that the logistical challenges, which Leslie Larson, who is an expert in digging up bodies, she maybe didn't see it as a challenge. For me, the idea of finding 200 bodies they essentially were buried in two different cemeteries along fence lines in the worst areas of the cemeteries that were underwater. I had no idea. They went out the very first month they went out to dig was in May, maybe 6-7 years ago now. And the whole end of the cemetery was underwater. They weren't even able to dig for the graves. They couldn't get the water out of the holes fast enough. And in addition to that, I wanted to tell listeners and readers, without being too graphic,
Sure.
I wanted them to explain, what does it take to exhume bodies? And in paupers' graves, for instance, they're buried 4 deep. So if Shannon says, I need this person who's on the bottom, they're picking up 3 other people. But, I found them to be so respectful of the bones, the boxes, the graves, the cemetery. And that was they just feel honored to be out there. And Leslie and Shannon both said to me, I can hear these people talking and they need us to talk for them.
Wow.
Who is funding all of this? It sounds like it is a project.
Yeah.
It's a huge project. The FBI funded part of it by bringing all their experts in from around the country. And to that, I think Detroit is forever thankful. In fact, the Detroit FBI is thankful that there was the ability to fund that. It just cost the money to bring an agent or an expert anthropologist in or evidence team member in and put them up overnight and feed them, right? But then in addition to that, a lot of it was just Shannon, her persistence, going out and knocking on doors, stopping at Detroit, the DTE, the telephone company, and saying, hi, can you bring a couple of your excavators over to this place in a couple of weeks? We want to use them to dig up graves. And the generosity of hardware stores to provide buckets and waters and water pumps. And, I think that's it. She just went out and said, this is for our city. Can you help us with this? And volunteers came out, provided food through 5 summers. So
Wow.
And the first summer was a little rough. So,
And
they didn't know it was going to happen.
Katherine, now, given your experience, nowadays true crime mysteries and is such a hot topic.
Huge,
It's huge.
huge.
People, and especially, would love to listen to that. In your experience, in your career span, and given the fact that you have such a diverse experience, why do you think that is? Why do you think it is that people are just so drawn to stories like this?
That's the true crime audience, I think, is very it weighs towards female. Mm-hmm. And I ask that same question of people with way more experience than I have, because my other writing experience is that I'm actually a mass killing expert. So the through line in my business is death, unfortunately.
Wow.
Yeah. So when you get an explosion, call me back. When you get a shooting at a school, call me back.
Wow.
But yeah, that's what I do in my free time. Now, I counsel companies and schools. And the idea for true crime is that I think that there is a large portion of true crime audience that is female, and it's been brought to me this way. 2 points. One, they fear for their own safety, and knowing that other people can get justice, social justice can occur. Justice can occur, whether it's race, socioeconomic situation, regional situations, that their justice can be served. I think that women who feel much more likely that they could be a victim, they find confidence and comfort in that. I think that's one of the things. And then I think the other is just that women are tenacious, and they themselves, and they're meticulous, and they want to champion other people and see something to the end. And that's really what happens in a true crime situation, where you're what we think of as reading about true crime, where some murder mystery is suddenly not a mystery anymore, or somebody gets vindicated for a crime they said people said they committed but they didn't commit.
You should start a podcast like Only Murders in the Building, like they do on that show.
Right.
So let me ask you this, and this is strictly your opinion. Genetic genealogy and rights to privacy. It seems to cross lines and blur ethics a bit. Or perhaps, do you think everybody in America should have their DNA on file? Probably make the FBI's job easier.
I certainly don't think everybody should have their DNA on file. DNA is like a fingerprint, and
right.
And as an FBI agent, my job was to uphold the Constitution, and the Constitution is it includes all the privacy rights that are every individual. So I'm a firm, staunch believer in privacy, in the rights that we have immured within the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So I do think, though, that genetic genealogy is just like so many other things that we didn't think would get out there. The idea, I remember in law school studying the case law, when people would take photographs of other people, and are you stealing somebody's image, and do you have a right to do that? And so every innovation that technology brings us, we have to evaluate how it's allowed, particularly in light of genetic genealogy. You're actually not having the DNA of an individual. You're cross-referencing a bunch of DNA, right, and then saying, this is who it must be, without ever having seen that person's DNA. And that is crazy to think of. And I think there will be eventually time in the courts, or in the court of public opinion, where we decide what's appropriate.
We were dealing with families at the border being separated, and children being separated from their parents, and had everyone's DNA been on file, you could have brought them back together as a family. So there are good things to having DNA on file.
Oh, yes. I agree. I mean, be clear. I completely agree. It's just like having somebody's fingerprints. We find somebody who's deceased or a lost child. If you have a photograph or a fingerprint, you can connect those people. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter what you do. You've reconnected family members. I completely agree with you. There's plenty of value in having DNA in files. And truthfully, there's how many people who spit into a tube and sent it to 23andMe and all these other places, and gave millions and millions of people access to their DNA. Right. So that DNA is all out there, and it's never coming back.
Yeah, mine's out there. Mine's all three of them: Ancestry, 23, all of them. Yeah.
And Katherine, before we go, I want to know, what are you most looking forward to when somebody sits down and picks up this book that they will experience?
Oh, wow. I've never been asked that. That's a lovely question. I wrote this as a nonfiction narrative, and I want the reader to want to turn the next page, because they want to see what Leslie and Shannon are doing and how they're solving their next problem. They had so many roadblocks, and they had so many wonderful things that happened. And I want the reader to say, I couldn't put this book down because I learned about DNA, and I learned about genetic genealogy, and I learned about police tenacity. And I felt for, maybe most importantly, I felt for these people who lost their family members, and I want them to be reconnected.
I am not surprised at all that a small team of dedicated women changed the system and, went for those people that escaped justice and brought some justice to people that were marginalized. So thank you for your work.
Yeah. Sometimes we overuse the word closure.
Yes.
But that's really the end game here, is closure, one way or another.
We're talking 30, 40, 50 years where people didn't know where one of their intimate family members was. And it turned out that, they were just a few miles away in a grave. And that may seem like, oh, that's sad. But Shannon Jones said every single person that she gives a notification to hugs her and cries and says, thank you.
Wow. Women Who Talk to the Dead.
Women Who Talk to the Dead.
Katherine Schweit.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us.
And people on YouTube must be looking at your background. Those windows have a beautiful forest behind them.
I do. I live in this lovely bucolic area. It's gorgeous. Thank you. I know that you can see why I set my camera up here.
Yeah.
This is where I wrote. This room is where I wrote most of the book.
Nice.
Oh, that's
It's
great.
very peaceful looking. So.
Katherine Schweit is an attorney, author, and former senior FBI official. Her latest book is titled Women Who Talk to the Dead, and it is out now. Is that right, Katherine?
It is out. Audio, video, no video, just audio and ebook and print.
Excellent. Thanks again,
Thank
Katherine,
you so
for joining
much.
us.
Thank you.
It was lovely. Thank you for talking to me today.
Yeah. Coming